On a gray Tuesday morning in the highlands of eastern Oregon, an engineer named Daniel Cole sat in his truck at the edge of a gravel access road, staring at a set of blueprints spread across his lap, and felt something shift inside his chest that he could only describe later as the sound of a lock clicking open. He had been hired by Meridian Renewables, a mid-sized wind energy developer, to finalize the interconnection study for a 42-turbine wind farm project stretched across nearly 6,000 acres of ridgeline. It was supposed to be a routine review. Check the transmission route, confirm the substation tie-in, sign off on the engineering. He had done this work a dozen times before for a dozen other projects, and none of them had ever made his hands go still on the steering wheel the way this one just had, because they're on page 14 of the transmission corridor survey. Next to a thin red line marking the only viable path for the underground collector cable, connecting the entire wind farm to the regional grid substation, 11 miles away, was a single parcel of land that did not belong to Meridian. It did not belong to any of the 40 other landowners who had already signed leases for turbine placement. It belonged to one man, a retired rancher named Walter Hargrove, who owned 400 acres of scrubland straddling the exact narrow saddle between two hills where the corridor had to pass, because it was the only ground low enough and flat enough for the cable trench. And every other route added over 3 miles of rock excavation that would cost the project an estimated $11 million more. Daniel flipped back through the file. There it was, tucked into a stack of routine paperwork the land acquisition team had filed 6 weeks earlier. A signed lease offer sent to Walter Hargrove for turbine siting rights on a small corner of his property. $1,200 a year. The same flat rate the company paid dozens of smaller landowners along the ridge for a single turbine pad and access road. Except Walter Hargrove didn't have a turbine on his land. He had something far more valuable, and nobody at Meridian, least of all the acquisitions team that had drafted his offer, seemed to understand it. Without Walter's 400 acres, the cable could not reach the substation. Without the cable reaching the substation, none of the 42 turbines already under contract could deliver a single watt of electricity to the grid. Every dollar Meridian had spent, every lease it had signed, every permit it had filed, all of it depended on convincing one aging rancher to sign a document that was worth, by Daniel's rough calculations, somewhere between $4 and $11 million to the company, and they had offered him $1,200 a year. Daniel set the blueprints down, picked up his phone, and typed a message to his project manager that would set off a chain of events neither the company nor Walter Hargrove could have predicted. "We have a problem with the interconnection corridor. I think you need to see this before anyone sends Hargrove a second offer." He didn't send it right away. He sat there a moment longer looking out at the ridge, at the wind moving through the dry grass exactly the way it would move through 42 sets of turbine blades if this project ever got built. And he wondered what kind of a man Walter Hargrove was, and whether anyone had bothered to tell him what he actually held in his hands. To understand how this moment came to be, it helps to go back nearly a year, to the day Meridian Renewables first drove up the county road toward the Hargrove Ranch with a folder full of paperwork, and a number they assumed no one would question. Walter Hargrove was 68 years old, and had lived his entire life within 20 miles of the ridge that now bore his family's name on county maps. His grandfather had homesteaded the land in the 1930s, running cattle through the dry months and hauling water up from the creek bed in the years the wells ran low. Walter had inherited the ranch from his father in his 30s, sold off most of the herd when his knees gave out in his 50s, and now spent his days doing what he called keeping the fences honest. A phrase that meant walking the property line every week or two, checking for breaks, watching for trespassers, and generally treating the land less like an asset and more like a relative he was responsible for. He was not, by his own admission, a businessman. He had a high school education, a working knowledge of irrigation systems and cattle genetics, and an instinctive distrust of anyone who showed up wearing a company polo shirt and carrying a clipboard. So when a black SUV rolled up his driveway on a spring afternoon, and two representatives from Meridian Renewables stepped out with a leather folder and a firm handshake, Walter's first instinct was suspicion, and his second instinct, the one that ultimately won out, was politeness. The lead representative, a land acquisitions manager named Craig Doyle, explained the pitch the way he had explained it to 40 other landowners along the ridge that year. Meridian was developing a wind energy project. They needed access across a small corner of Walter's northern acreage, not for a turbine, since the terrain there was too low and sheltered from consistent wind to be useful for power generation, but for what Doyle described only as supporting infrastructure. In exchange, Meridian was offering an annual lease payment of $1,200, adjusted slightly for inflation over the life of the 25-year agreement, along with a one-time signing bonus of $2,000. Walter asked what kind of supporting infrastructure. Doyle told him it was an underground utility corridor, cables, essentially, that would run beneath a section of his land to connect the wind farm to the existing power grid. Nothing would be visible from the surface once construction was finished. No turbines, no roads beyond a temporary construction access route that would be restored afterward, no ongoing disruption to his grazing operations. It sounded, on the surface, like a reasonable and fairly harmless deal. $1,200 a year for a strip of underground cable Walter would never even see. He told Doyle he'd think about it, which was the polite Western way of saying he had no intention of signing anything without understanding it first, and Doyle left a copy of the lease agreement on the kitchen table along with his business card. For the next several weeks, the offer sat in a drawer while Walter went about his usual routine, occasionally mentioning it to his neighbors, most of whom had already signed similar-looking agreements for turbine pads on their own land, generally, for figures ranging from $4,000 to $12,000 a year per turbine. Depending on how many machines were sited on their property, Walter noted without much alarm that his own offer was considerably smaller than what his neighbors were getting, but reasoned that made sense. After all, he wasn't getting a turbine. He was just getting a buried cable. It was, in his mind, a minor inconvenience with a small but steady payout, the kind of deal a rancher took because it was easy money and didn't cost him anything real. What Walter did not know, and what none of the acquisitions team at Meridian seemed to fully grasp either, was that his small corner of low ground was not an incidental detail of the project. It was the single point through which the entire wind farm's ability to generate revenue depended. Daniel Cole had been an interconnection engineer for 11 years. Most of that time spent bouncing between renewable energy developers, who needed someone to handle the unglamorous but absolutely critical work of figuring out how a wind farm solar array or battery storage facility actually got its electricity from the turbines and panels to the transmission lines that carried power to homes and businesses. It was a job most people outside the industry had never heard of and few people inside the industry fully appreciated, because interconnection engineering didn't produce anything visible. No one photographed a cable trench for a company brochure. But without it, a wind farm was nothing more than 42 very large, very expensive lawn ornaments. Daniel had joined the Hargrove Ridge Wind Project, the internal name Meridian used for the development, 6 weeks before the drive that would change everything. Brought on as a contractor to finalize the collector system design after the original interconnection engineer had left the company for a competing developer. His job was straightforward: review the proposed cable routing between the turbine array and the point of interconnection with the regional utilities substation, confirm it met code and terrain requirements, and sign off so construction permitting could move forward. It was during this review that Daniel noticed something that should have been flagged months earlier by the land acquisitions team, but apparently had not been, because the acquisitions team and the engineering team at most developers, Meridian included, rarely spoke to each other in any detail. Acquisitions secured land rights. Engineering figured out how to build on it. The assumption, almost always correct, was that any parcel needed for turbines or infrastructure would simply get folded into the standard leasing process at the standard rate, and nobody would think twice about it. But the terrain across the Hargrove Ridge project area was unusually steep and rocky, cut by a series of basalt outcroppings that made underground cable trenching prohibitively expensive across most of the eastern half of the project footprint. The only cost-effective route for the collector cable, the underground line that would gather electricity from all 42 turbines and carry it to the substation interconnection point, ran directly through a narrow, low-lying saddle of land that belonged entirely to Walter Hargrove. Daniel checked the alternative routes first, because that was standard due diligence, and what he found only confirmed the severity of the problem. Rerouting the cable corridor around Hargrove's land to the north would require blasting through nearly 2 miles of solid rock, adding an estimated $7 to $9 million in construction costs, and pushing the project's completion timeline back by at least 8 months, jeopardizing the tax credit qualification window the entire financial model depended on. Rerouting to the south wasn't viable at all. The land there belonged to a wildlife refuge buffer zone where transmission construction was legally restricted. In other words, there was exactly one path the cable could take, and Walter Hargrove owned every foot of it. Daniel sat with that fact for the better part of an afternoon, cross-referencing the acquisitions file to make sure he wasn't missing an easement or right-of-way that might make the problem moot. He wasn't. The lease Meridian had sent Walter Hargrove, the $1,200 a year offer sitting unsigned in a kitchen drawer 60 miles away, was not a minor formality. It was the single point of failure for the entire project. If Walter refused to sign or negotiated for anything Meridian wasn't willing to pay, there was no wind farm, not a smaller wind farm, not a delayed wind farm, no wind farm at all because there was no way to get the power out. This was the moment Daniel picked up his phone in the truck at the edge of the gravel road, and it was the moment that would define what happened over the following 4 months. Daniel's message to his project manager, a soft-spoken but sharp operations director named Renata Ibarra, did exactly what he hoped it would do. It got immediate attention. Within 2 hours, Renata had pulled in the acquisition's lead, Craig Doyle, along with the company's regional development director, a man named Peter Voss, who had flown in from the Portland headquarters specifically to understand how a project 3 months from breaking ground had just developed a potentially fatal flaw. The meeting that followed, which Daniel attended by video call from a rest stop parking lot because he hadn't had time to drive back to the office, was tense in a way that revealed more about the company's internal culture than anyone in the room probably intended. Doyle's first instinct was to minimize the problem. He pointed out that the lease had already been sent to Hargrove, that the standard rate had been offered, and that most landowners eventually signed standard leases even when they grumbled about the amount. Because most people didn't have the patience or the resources to negotiate against a company with in-house lawyers. He suggested simply waiting Hargrove out, assuming that eventually the appeal of free money, even a small amount, would win over a retired rancher with no other buyer for an easement across an isolated stretch of scrubland. Daniel pushed back immediately, laying out the interconnection analysis in plain terms. This was not a discretionary corner of the project. It was the only viable corridor. If Hargrove refused to sign, or if he signed with someone else who alerted him to what he actually held, the project as designed could not proceed. Full stop. He was not asking the room to pay Hargrove out of generosity. He was telling them that the entire capital investment in the Hargrove Ridge Wind Project, projected at the time to be around $190 million, depended on convincing one man to sign a piece of paper. And that the offer currently in his kitchen drawer was almost insulting relative to what it was actually worth. Peter Voss, to his credit, understood the stakes faster than Doyle did. He asked Daniel directly what he thought a fair offer would look like, given the leverage Hargrove now held. Daniel, who was an engineer and not a negotiator, gave a rough estimate based on typical compensation structures he'd seen at other projects, where a critical parcel had emerged as a bottleneck, rather than a flat annual lease payment. Hargrove should be offered either a substantially higher fixed payment reflecting the true value of the easement, or more fairly in Daniel's view, a small percentage of the project's ongoing revenue, since without his land, there was no revenue for anyone. Voss did not love the second option. Revenue-sharing arrangements were rare in the industry precisely because they set precedents other landowners might later demand, and because they complicated the financial models lenders and tax equity investors expected to see before funding a project. But he understood, better than Doyle, that a delayed or canceled project was infinitely worse for the company's bottom line than a slightly less favorable one, and he authorized a new offer to be drafted quietly, without immediately revealing to Hargrove why the number had changed so dramatically. This decision, to increase the offer without explaining the reason, would turn out to be the company's second mistake, arguably a more costly one than the original lowball number, because it meant Walter Hargrove was about to be approached again by the same team that had already, in his mind, tried to shortchange him once. And by the time that second visit happened, Walter would no longer be operating with only his own instincts to guide him. Word travels quickly in rural communities, particularly when it concerns money, land, and the sudden appearance of corporate SUVs on gravel roads. Within days of Daniel's discovery circulating quietly through Meridian's internal channels. A version of the story, stripped of confidential financial details, but retaining the core fact that the Hargrove parcel is a bottleneck for the whole project, had reached a mid-level project scheduler who happened to be married to someone from the same rural county where Walter lived. That connection, entirely coincidental and entirely human, was how the truth eventually found its way to Walter before Meridian's revised offer did. The message reached Walter through his neighbor, a woman named Carol Anders, who ran a smaller cattle operation 2 properties down and had already leased 2 turbine sites to Meridian the previous year. Carol had a nephew doing seasonal maintenance work on wind projects across the state. And the nephew had heard through a colleague who had heard through a friend at Meridian's regional office that there was some kind of engineering problem tied specifically to Hargrove's land, something about the cable route having nowhere else to go. Carol drove over to Walter's place on a Sunday afternoon and told him what she'd heard, framing it carefully because she didn't fully understand the technical details herself. But even in its simplified second-hand form, the core message was unmistakable. Whatever Meridian had offered him, it was not a fair reflection of what his land was actually worth to them, because without it, they apparently couldn't build the project at all. Walter, who had spent 68 years learning to be careful before making decisions about his land, did not immediately act on second-hand gossip, but he also did not dismiss it. Instead, he did something that would prove to be the single most important decision he made in the entire saga. He called his adult daughter Melissa Hargrove-Ortiz, who had left the ranch decades earlier to become a commercial real estate attorney in Denver, and asked her almost sheepishly whether she'd be willing to take a look at some paperwork from a wind company. Melissa's reaction, once she reviewed the lease and heard her father's account of what Carol had told him, was immediate and firm. She told her father not to sign anything, not to respond to any further offers verbally, and not to let anyone from Meridian back onto the property without her present, either in person or by phone. She then spent the better part of a week doing what her father had never had the resources or expertise to do, researching the specific mechanics of wind farm interconnection transmission easements and the leverage a single landowner could hold when their property represented what she came to understand in industry terms as a critical path parcel. What Melissa discovered confirmed everything Carol's second-hand account had suggested, and then some. Interconnection corridors for wind projects were in fact frequently the source of exactly this kind of dispute. And case law across several states had established that landowners holding critical path parcels were entitled to negotiate compensation, reflecting the actual economic value they contributed to a project, not merely a flat per acre or per turbine rate designed for interchangeable non-critical land. She also learned, through a colleague who specialized in energy infrastructure law, that some landowners in similar positions had successfully negotiated ownership stakes, long-term revenue percentages, or lump sum payments in the high 6 or even 7 figures precisely, because a stalled multi-hundred-million-dollar project represented catastrophic risk to a developer's financing tax credit eligibility. And investor relationships. By the time Meridian's revised offer letter arrived, the one Peter Voss had authorized, still not explaining why it had increased, Walter Hargrove was no longer the same man who had tucked the original lease into a kitchen drawer and mostly forgotten about it. He was, for the first time in his life, holding what his daughter had bluntly described to him over the phone as the most valuable 400 acres in the county, and he intended to treat the negotiation accordingly. Craig Doyle returned to the Hargrove Ranch on a warm July morning, this time accompanied not by a junior associate but by Peter Voss himself, a signal, intended or not, that the company understood this negotiation had escalated in importance. They brought a revised lease agreement offering an annual payment of $18,000, more than 14 times the original figure, along with a signing bonus of $25,000. By any ordinary measure, it was a dramatic increase, the kind of number that might have overwhelmed a landowner who had gone from expecting $1,200 to being offered $18,000. But Walter, sitting at his kitchen table with his daughter on speakerphone, did not react the way Doyle and Voss expected. He asked calmly why the offer had increased so significantly if nothing about the actual use of his land had changed. Voss, caught slightly off guard, offered a vague explanation about internal budget adjustments and recognizing the value of long-term community partnerships. It was not a convincing answer, and Melissa, listening over the phone, interjected to ask a more direct question: whether the increase had anything to do with the fact that the underground collector cable route had no viable alternative path other than through her father's property. The silence that followed, according to Walter's later account, lasted long enough that he was certain of the answer before either Doyle or Voss said a word. Voss, to his credit, did not try to deny it outright once pressed. He acknowledged that the terrain constraints made the Hargrove parcel an important part of the routing plan, though he stopped short of using the words Melissa had already used in her own research: critical path, single point of failure, bottleneck. It was enough. Walter told them he appreciated the increased offer, but would need more time to review it with his attorney, and the meeting ended considerably more coolly than it had begun. Doyle and Voss drove back down the gravel road aware, for the first time, that they were no longer negotiating with an uninformed rancher weighing whether easy money was worth a small inconvenience. They were negotiating with someone who understood, in full, the actual value of what he controlled. What followed over the next 6 weeks was less a negotiation than a slow, careful recalibration of power between two parties who had started from wildly unequal positions, and were now, for the first time, meeting somewhere closer to even ground. Melissa took over communications directly, sparing her father the discomfort of sitting across from corporate representatives while numbers in the hundreds of thousands of dollars were discussed. She proposed a structure that moved away from a flat annual lease entirely, instead suggesting a combination approach. A substantial upfront payment to compensate for construction impact and long-term easement rights paired with an ongoing annual royalty, calculated as a small percentage of the wind farm's gross electricity revenue. Structured similarly to arrangements Melissa had found precedent for in Texas and Iowa wind projects facing comparable routing constraints. Meridian's legal and finance teams resisted the revenue-sharing structure initially, exactly as Daniel had predicted they would in that first tense internal meeting months earlier. Peter Voss argued that a percentage of revenue arrangement created unpredictable long-term liabilities and could complicate the project's ability to secure tax equity financing since investors preferred fixed, predictable cost structures. Melissa countered that a canceled or indefinitely delayed project, which was the realistic alternative if Meridian refused to acknowledge the actual leverage her father held represented a far larger and more certain liability than a modest ongoing royalty tied to a project that if built would generate revenue for 25 years or more. The financial modeling that followed involved back and forth between Meridian's finance team and outside consultants over the course of nearly a month, running scenarios to determine what level of royalty payment the project could absorb while still meeting the return thresholds required by its investors. Daniel, still involved as the interconnection engineer of record, was occasionally pulled into these conversations to confirm technical details, reconfirming, each time asked, that no alternative routing existed that would meaningfully reduce Meridian's dependence on the Hargrove parcel. Each time he confirmed it, the company's negotiating position weakened slightly further, because it removed the last remaining bluff Meridian's team had been quietly hoping to use, the implication that they might simply root around Hargrove's land if he pushed too hard. Eventually, after several rounds of counteroffers, the two sides settled on an agreement that would have seemed almost unimaginable to Walter Hargrove on the spring afternoon Craig Doyle first pulled into his driveway. The final terms included an upfront easement and construction impact payment of $400,000, along with an ongoing annual royalty equal to 1.5% of the wind farm's gross electricity sales for the full 25-year life of the project, a figure that, based on Meridian's own revenue projections, was expected to pay Walter somewhere between $90,000 and $140,000 per year, depending on wind conditions and electricity market prices for the next quarter century. It was, by any reasonable measure, a transformation from the original offer that bordered on absurd, from $1,200 a year to a deal likely worth well over $3 million across the life of the agreement. For Walter, the settlement was not really about the money, though he would be the first to admit the money changed things for his family in ways he hadn't expected. It meant he could finally repair the decades-old barn roof he'd been patching instead of replacing, help fund his grandchildren's education, and stop worrying, in the quiet way older ranchers often do, about what would happen to the land after he was gone. What mattered more to him, he told a local reporter who eventually caught wind of the story, was simply being treated fairly. And the discomfort of realizing how close he had come to signing away something of enormous value for almost nothing, simply because no one had bothered to explain to him what he actually held. For Daniel, the episode reinforced something he had come to believe over more than a decade in the renewable energy industry: that the unglamorous, often invisible technical work of interconnection engineering carried enormous consequences not just for developers and investors, but for the ordinary landowners whose property happened to sit at a critical juncture nobody in the acquisitions department had thought to flag. He continued working in the industry, and though he never sought credit for what happened at Hargrove Ridge, word of the story spread quietly among colleagues, and it became in a small way a cautionary tale repeated in land acquisition training sessions at more than one company. Check the engineering before you send the offer, because the flattest, quietest corner of a property is sometimes the most valuable acre in the entire project. For Meridian, the wind farm was eventually built roughly 9 months behind the original schedule, its 42 turbines rising along the ridge, exactly where the original plans had called for them, their blades turning in the same wind that had blown across Walter Hargrove's family land for nearly a century before anyone thought to put a price on it. The underground cable ran, as it always had to, directly beneath the low saddle of ground on Walter's northern acreage, carrying every watt of electricity the project would ever generate through the one piece of land the company had once tried to lease for $1,200 a year. And somewhere in a filing cabinet at Meridian's regional office, a lesson sat quietly recorded in the fine print of a renegotiated contract: that in the business of building power, the most important connection is not always the one running through the largest turbine or the tallest transmission tower, but the one running through the person who understands before anyone else does exactly what they are holding. 3 years after the turbines began turning, Walter Hargrove still walked his fence line every week or two, the same habit he'd kept since his father's time. Except now the walk took him past a low green utility cabinet, marking the point where his land's underground cable joined the rest of the collector system, humming faintly with the electricity of 42 machines. He could see silhouetted against the sky from nearly anywhere on his property. He rarely mentioned the negotiation anymore, not out of any bitterness, but because it had simply become part of the rhythm of his life. The royalty checks arriving quarterly, the barn roof long since repaired. His grandchildren's college account steadily growing in a way that would have seemed like a fantasy to him during the spring afternoon he'd first tucked an unopened lease offer into a kitchen drawer. Melissa visited more often than she used to. In part because there was simply more reason to. Property tax questions, occasional inquiries from other developers eyeing land farther down the ridge, and a standing joke between her and her father that she'd become almost against her will the unofficial legal advisor to half the ranching families in the county whenever a company with a leather folder and a firm handshake came calling. More than one neighbor, having heard the full story, by then had taken to calling her before signing anything at all. And Melissa found a strange, quiet satisfaction in it. Not the money, since she never charged her father's neighbors more than a token consulting fee, but the sense that a lesson learned the hard way in her own family's kitchen was now protecting people who might otherwise never have known to ask the right questions. Daniel Cole moved on to other projects, as engineers in his line of work generally do, spending the following years on interconnection studies for solar farms in Nevada and a battery storage facility outside Boise. He kept tucked away in a folder on his laptop a copy of that original 14-page transmission corridor survey, the one with the thin red line crossing Walter Hargrove's land. Less as a memento of pride and more as a private reminder of how thin the margin often was between a project quietly succeeding and a company quietly making a costly, avoidable mistake. He made it a habit on every project afterward to personally review the acquisitions file for any parcel touching a transmission or collector route before a single offer letter went out, a small procedural change that cost him almost nothing in time, and that he was privately certain had already saved at least one other landowner somewhere from being offered pennies for land worth a fortune. As for Meridian, the Hargrove Ridge project ultimately became one of the company's most profitable assets in the region, generating steady returns for its investors for years after construction wrapped. Its financial performance closely tracking the optimistic end of the projections Renata Ibarra's team had modeled back when the crisis first erupted. Peter Voss, who had authorized the revised offer that started the real negotiation, was later promoted to oversee land acquisition strategy company-wide. And one of his first initiatives in that role was instituting a formal requirement that every proposed lease offer be cross-checked against the engineering team's interconnection and routing plans before it left the office, a policy that employees, only half-joking, began referring to internally as the Hargrove Rule. Craig Doyle left the company within the year, not because of any single failure, but because the episode had quietly reshaped how Meridian's leadership viewed the acquisitions process he had built his career on, and he found less appetite for his particular style of negotiation in the years that followed. He was, by most accounts, not a dishonest man, simply one who had never been trained to look past a spreadsheet of standard rates and ask a harder question. What does this specific piece of ground actually make possible, and what would happen to everything else if it disappeared? It was a question Walter Hargrove had never needed to ask about his own land, because he had lived his entire life understanding in his bones, if not in financial terms, that some ground simply mattered more than other ground, that a narrow saddle between two ridgelines, unremarkable to look at, dry and windswept, and seemingly worthless for growing anything, could nonetheless be the single thread holding an entire enterprise together. It had just taken an engineer with a set of blueprints, a quiet moment in a parked truck, and the willingness to ask an uncomfortable question inside his own company, for everyone else to finally see what Walter had been standing on all along.